time on the BIAL Foundation Symposium, The Mystery of Time. I'm Teresa Firmino. I'm a science journalist at newspaper Público, and it's an honor to be here to host this roundtable, which is, by the way, broadcasting via streaming, so people will watch not just the scientific audience, but also a non-scientific audience. So I will have for the next 2 hours with me Professor Jimena Canales, historian of science at the University of Illinois in USA, Professor Dean Buonomano, neuroscientist at University of California in Los Angeles, Professor Wolf Singer, neuroscientist and director emeritus at Max Planck Institute for Brain Research, and Professor Joseph Takahashi, neuroscientist, chair of the Department of Neurosciences at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and also researcher at the University of Texas. Joseph, I will start with you. You have been studying molecular clocks and the genetic basis of the circadian clocks in mammals just now for decades. In 1978, your team discovered an important gene, the clock gene, and since then many other circadian genes have been found. Let's imagine that this scenario, that you are in a cave for, let's say, a dark cave for 1 year or so. What will happen to your circadian clocks on that scenario?
Very interesting question. So that experiment was done a few times. One that I recall was done in 1938 by Nathaniel Kleitman, one of the fathers of the field of sleep. And he went into a cave underground for almost 40 days. And what they found is that they still went through sleep-wake cycles, even though they had no clocks or time cues and no environment, no sun. But the timing of their sleep-wake cycles drifted. They didn't document exactly the time in that experiment. That was done many years later by actually recording people's sleep-wake cycles. And what was important is they persisted. We still have 24-hour clocks that function in the absence of the sun and in the absence of environmental cues. Now this was, I don't know if you want me to go on, but this was studied systematically first by Jürgen Aschoff, who was a Max Planck director in Erlangen-Andechs, Germany. And he had these underground apartments. It was known as the bunker. And in those apartments, volunteers could live for a very long period of time. They could control the light. They had 24-hour meal service. I think they're only allowed 1 bottle of beer a day, though, on average. But they measured body temperature rhythms, which have a very good circadian rhythm in people. And there they could show, again, that we all have internal clocks that persist in constant conditions. Each of us is slightly different. Most of us have long clocks, longer than 24, but some of us have shorter clocks. Those are the minority. And so that was one of the beginnings of our field in the early 60s, the systematic study of human circadian rhythms.
So light is a main factor for controlling our circadian rhythm, but that's not the only one.
Yeah, so light is the major synchronizer of our clocks, there's a master clock in our brain, in the base of the brain, that responds to light. But once the genes were discovered by my lab and others, what we found is there are clocks throughout our entire body. And today we would say every cell in your body has the potential to have a clock. And those clocks don't respond to the sun directly. They're responding indirectly to cues. Many of them are nutritional or circulating in our bloodstream. And they also respond to our body temperature rhythm. which synchronizes.
You'll say that the master clock is in the brain and it responds to light, but the other several clocks, so this means other genes, I suppose, are in the cells and they're activated or not, responding to the circadian rhythm. Is that correct?
That's correct. They actually all use the same genes. The clock is actually the same. The only difference is this input signal to those clocks.
So could you describe a bit how the whole system is working or not working? In a plain language, I mean.
Yeah, the way we like to think about it is the master clock in the brain is similar to a conductor of a symphony. That master clock provides the synchronization timing for the orchestra in our body, which are all the other individual clocks. And normally, our body follows our brain because we're not traveling in a jet under normal circumstances or obviously during human evolution. And so our systems are not accustomed to rapid movement of our clocks. We can slowly adjust. And so normally the whole system is in sync. And the brain really is in charge because it's giving this timing signal like a conductor.
So, but I mean, how many, I don't know how many circadian genes are known at this point.
Yeah, we would say there are at least 6 core genes, but those are modulated by another 24 genes that we know of. And if we tried, I had to make a list recently. That list had something like 72 genes on it. So it's the number is growing as we find more and more regulators of the system. But the core is really a handful, small number.
You said on your talk that these genes, then they control thousands of genes each day. So they turn on and then turn off thousands of genes in our cells. So the whole body is doing this turn on and turn off.
Yeah, that's one of the new, more recent realizations once we were able to look at, all the genes in the genome. What we came to realize is that the majority of our genes can oscillate. If you look at many different tissues, you'll find that in almost every tissue, one of your favorite genes might be oscillating.
You also presented on your talk interesting results on mice and how the circadian rhythms are related to health, aging, and also lifespan. Could you share with the audience those results, because they are really fascinating? And they have to do with the food restriction, and also not only that, the time we eat is very important.
Yes, thank you for the question. So what my lab has been working on for the last 5 years or so is to see, well, the field has found that the timing that you eat is very important for your metabolism. I should say, if you're a mouse, the time you eat is very important. That's what we study in the laboratory. And so if a mouse eats a Western diet, high-fat diet, at one time it becomes fat, but at another time it's protected if it eats at the correct time, which is the waking time of the mouse. That work has actually been applied to people more recently, not by our lab, but by other labs, and there is evidence that now that even time restriction for eating is beneficial for humans. This has led to a number of fad diets, which I'm sure you've read about. The 8-16 diet, which is a diet where people eat within an 8-hour window. So we would say, that there is evidence for that. What isn't clear in the fad diet is the timing of that, what we would call the phase. It matters what that 8-hour window is. Okay. So if you were on the fad diet but you only ate between midnight and 8 a.m., that would be, in our experience, in our experiments, that would be the wrong time. What you need to do is eat when you're awake and active. And so we've applied those kinds of experiments to mice to ask whether that affects lifespan and health span. And so it's well known in the aging field that if you reduce the calories, you can extend lifespan. It's the most effective intervention for increasing lifespan. This has been shown in all animals, I would say, with the exception of humans, because the experiment is too hard to do. It takes too long. You know, we live too long to do that experiment. But in a mouse, if you reduce calories by, say, 30%, you can live 30% longer. That's a huge increase. Imagine if we lived 30% longer.
So actually, we already know how to know how interfere and know the reason why something could work or not by interfering with the circadian rhythm. That's what your results, the meaning of your results, right?
Well, what we found is that the time that the mice eat makes a huge difference in how long they live. Mm-hmm. It's a difference between 10% longer and 35% longer. Eating exactly the same food, but just at the right time.
So I don't want to make you a food advisor for us, but and you said that it's really difficult to translate this to humans. But what kind of advice you would give us? How we should respond to that?
Yeah, so for us, it's very hard to reduce our calories by 30%. That's very severe for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And so what we're testing now is the idea, can you just reduce the time that you eat and not so much the calories? And can we show a benefit of that? And if that was true, then that would be easier for all of us to adopt. Mm-hmm. Restricting the time, but not so much the calories. Okay? And so there are studies already not measuring lifespan, but measuring other health measures, glucose regulation, blood pressure, things like that. And those show that actually time-restricted eating is beneficial, even for people. And so we would say you should eat, first of all, you should still eat breakfast. And it's better to start early, but to end early. And we would also say you don't have to be so strict and restrict yourself to 8 hours. Our experiments say that 12 hours is fine. Mm-hmm. For lifespan.
So thank you. Mm-hmm. Professor Wolf, now we are still discussing the aspects of the biology of time, and actually you study the time in the brain. And you have proposed an interesting theory of the brain working as an orchestra. If I understood correctly, your theory, which is, I have to say, a bit difficult for a layperson to understand. So if a brain works as an orchestra, the number of neuron fires are important to convey and represent information about objects, but also the time itself carries information. Could you explain a bit your theory? If I'm completely wrong, so please.
No, you're perfectly right. Thank you for the question, which is, of course, a difficult one to answer. We know that the brain is a very distributed system. Many different processes occurring in many different places, and they all have to be coordinated somehow to produce behavior. Mm-hmm. And this is true both for cognition, so for the representation of the sensory environment, as well as for the orchestration of movement. You always have many, many different areas in the brain that have to be active at the same time. And I think yesterday in the talk I gave an example of how you could imagine that a concrete object in the outer world is represented inside of the brain. Mm-hmm. Because if it's a polymodal object, so an object that exists in various domains, like a barking dog, You hear the noise, you hear the barks, you can touch the fur, you have tactile information, you can see the animal, it's a visual information, and you also know where it is. So there's also spatial coordinates that you have to take care of. And all this information is conveyed by different sensory organs, from the retina, from the touch sense, from the auditory sense, and is processed in different places in the brain. Now, these places are very intimately connected among each other. They all reciprocally talk to each other. It's like a big party conversation. And the problem is that there is no conductor in the brain, no observer, no center on top of all this that would observe what's going on and then make the interpretation, this is a barking dog. And I forgot to mention there's also other centers in the brain that attach value to these sensory objects. So whether you should be afraid of the dog because it looks aggressive or whether it's a tame dog which you can huddle. So all this needs to be put together in order to generate this percept of this very dog, individual dog with its particular emotional connotations that you add. And all this has to be done without there being a place in the brain where there is a representation of this very dog. The old concepts, also proposed by Descartes, for example, was that there is such a center in the brain, because that's what you think. If you want to relate something, have it united in a single place. That is intuitively the most plausible. And Descartes actually was looking for such a place in the brain. And he asked students to go to the slaughterhouse and bring him brains. And he looked into them and looked for a singular center. Most of the brain is bipartite, it has two hemispheres. Most structures are double. So they were excluded. You needed a single center. And there are only two really prominent places in the brain. This is the hypophysis, which is a gland in the brain. And there's the epiphysis, which in humans is mainly calcified. But it has something to do with the circadian clock, for example.
Pineal gland.
Yeah, the pineal gland. Yeah. And the students took these brains out of the skull of the cows, and the hypophysis usually gets disrupted because it's in own house, so it doesn't come with it unless you prepare it. So he only saw the epiphysis. And this is where he put the seat of the self, the observer in the brain, and he thought this is where everything comes together and is then coherently interpreted. Now we know nowadays this is not at all the case. So the question we are confronted with is a challenging one, is how is this highly distributed activity that is in different sensory systems at the same time, they all talk to each other, there is no conductor in that brain, there is no observer in the brain, and still you have this coherent percept. How is that possible? And there is an early saying that has to do also with, it's a little bit related to the problem of consciousness. How come that everything comes together in consciousness, is simultaneously there? And Sherrington, an old physiologist, classical, beginning of last century, he posed himself that problem and said, well, there are two ways in order to relate things with each other. One is the spatial solution of Descartes, and the other one is a temporal solution. He said it's simultaneity in the temporal dimension that makes that things are understood as belonging together, and you don't have to converge on a single place. So it's unity in time rather than unity in space. That's what he said, and I think that's a good concept.
So it's kind of a temporal code for in the brain, like a code Morse or a Morse code, or
yeah, it's not a Morse code, but there is something very peculiar, which I think is intuitively very plausible. If something happens at the same time, you tend to bind it together. It could be pure correlation, but usually we think that there is some causal binding mechanism that makes that these things occur together. Likewise, if this happens before this, you tend to establish a causal relation. And probably there's one reason that this is how the statistical contiguities in the natural world that are around us, in which we are embedded, actually functions. There is some logic in it. The cause has to come before the effect. And what is so interesting is that the learning rules that are implemented in the brain that make two neurons which are connected, let's assume there are many neurons connected to each other, but there are two out of the many that happen to be activated very often together because they respond to something which in the world also happens very often together. And during development, when neurons are very often activated together, they start to intensify their connections. They become coupled more tightly. And then translate this statistical relation of events in the outside world into stronger anatomical coupling. So they translate a temporal relation through correlation of activity of responses into an anatomical connection. And this is, as we think that the brain learns about statistical regularities in the outer world. And once you have this, you can use this in order to relate A with B, not by making it converge onto a Descartes unit, but just have those two elements be correlated in time.
So an important word is synchrony. You mentioned it.
Yeah.
On that representation.
Yes, one could call it synchrony. I got a bit careful in using synchrony because it has been challenged by many people because they are right. Imagine that this whole orchestra plays in synchrony. It's very boring and very poor information. What you want to have is that there be a rapid violin and then there be a slower tuba and so on. Okay. Still, they have to obey some temporal coordination, but you need to have a plurality of rhythms, a plurality of phase relations. So, yeah, you code relations in time. You have a spatial code as well. The two are combined. Nature takes what it gets. So
synchrony is not the best word.
Yeah.
Okay. But about your theory, it has been a bit difficult to get conclusive evidences about what your proposal. So why you think might happen?
Because things tend, and Dean is probably the one who can answer this best. Things tend to become very complicated. See, the initial simple idea that whatever belongs together, like the various features of this bottle, they would just form a synchronous assembly somewhere in the brain. This was initial hypothesis, a simple thought. But now we learn that we have to do with networks where many elements that are responsive to particular features in the world outside are coupled reciprocally. So A talks to B, B talks to A, C talks to A and B, and they all mutually interact. And you can imagine what happens already if three bodies that have their own rhythm, like three pendula, swing and they are interacting because you coupled them with rubber somehow. So they are elastically coupled, like neurons are coupled through their connections. And this system of only three bodies, when you make it started to swing, produces a dynamics that is extremely nonlinear, very difficult to grasp with mathematical formula. And if you go a little bit more complex, you get very quickly systems that can be chaotic. And if you have thousands of neurons that talk to each other reciprocally all the time from different sensory modalities, you get what we call a very high dimensional dynamic state. So you have not only x, y, z Cartesian coordinates, and maybe as fourth coordinate time, but you have all the possible phase relations with these many, many elements. So you get would it be okay to say it's nearly infinitely dimensional?
Nearly.
Nearly. And this creates the space in which the brain can store information, can combine information. But this is so unimaginably complex, since we are not used to think in more than 4 dimensions. For me, it's 3, but some people can think in 4 dimensions. Some quantum physicists claim they could even imagine another one. I doubt they can. So we have a problem. We have a system inside this skull that exists in a dynamic space and operates in it that we cannot intuitively grasp, because we are used to work in a low-dimensional world. The input is low-dimensional, the output is low-dimensional, but the processes that link the input to the output is extremely high-dimensional, and we have no intuition for it. Had we an intuition, I would be out of job. And this makes our work so difficult, because we have started in the beginning, when I'm an old man now, so I remember the beginning. We were very convinced, because we followed this behaviorist idea, the brain is a stimulus-response machine. Let's study how the sensory information, physical stimuli are transformed in neural activity, then follow this stream of activity through the brain until we get out on the other side on the motor path. And then we thought, if we do this carefully, we will have understood how it works. Wrong, unfortunately, because now we know that the brain has the initiative. It is constantly generating hypotheses with its own dynamics. It takes a little bit of sensory information, interprets it. On the basis of its a priori knowledge, we call it predictive coding, or this knowledge we call priors. And to analyze the dynamics of this thing, and also the memory trace, to find out how it is storing all this knowledge, we would have to record from many, 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 many different neurons at the same time, analyze the dynamics. This is what we do nowadays, but we don't see anything. If you plot all these responses of the neurons on a paper sheet, you have 60 or 100 of them, and every time it fires, you make a dot. You look at it, you see nothing. Nothing that you can make sense out of it. So we need computers, we need statistical methods that downscale this to something we can again see. But I think we have the same problem as the physicists that were among us when they had to enter quantum physics world. It transcends our imagination or our intuition. And then you have abstract descriptions. And what does it help you? If I tell you that, you know, the neuron representation of this barking dog is a vector in a whatever dimensional space,
so what
does it feel like a dog?
Oh, go ahead.
The depressing part is that the brain is made of these high-dimensional states, but is terrible at understanding these high-dimensional states. So that's the unfortunate part.
So what you are saying is that now it's hard to get evidences on your theory, but it's also a matter of technology, not only.
Well, it's only recently that that we have the technology in hand to really register the activity of thousands and thousands of neurons at the same time. It's mainly optical techniques, but they're also microelectrodes. It's the same technology that you use in computer design. So it's thin film technology. You can record from a very large number of neurons, but still you have this problem to interpret what you see. And then you have to put it in relation to behavior, because there is a nice example, a theoretical study that has been published about 2 years ago, whether if somebody gave you a motherboard of a computer and gave you all the methods in order to record, measure simultaneously what all these currents and transistors and capacitors and resistors do, you would not be able to understand what this is good for.
So it's not only technology.
Yeah, and this is the problem. We have
Exactly.
at least we have behavior, and we have clinics, and we know if this part is damaged, then this function disappears. But We are at the very beginning.
So, Dean, thank you. Dean, so do you want to add anything more to the question of you will know better? Why it's so hard?
No, I don't. I disagree with him. I don't know better. But in a way, that's our job security, that no one knows. I mean, and I think this gets to, slightly deeper philosophical issue, is that the brain is made of a very sophisticated computational system, but the computational system is terrible at understanding the computational system that it's made of. So I think it's a deep question of what the techniques we will need, and even to the extent that it's possible for the brain to understand itself, because as Wolf mentioned, most people accept that we don't understand at the intuitive level quantum mechanics. It just doesn't make sense. It's clearly correct, but it doesn't make sense, and that's just a limitation, a constraint of our brains. You know, at the end of the day, we are unusually smart apes, and I think we have to be a bit humble in our acceptance of what we can and we cannot understand.
Yeah, you have one of your books is precisely the brain bugs.
Yeah.
So exactly, what are the limitations and also the strengths of our brain?
So the brain is this incredibly powerful computational device. It's one of the most complex devices in the known universe, I think we can say. But it's really quite bad at some things. You know, if I ask somebody to divide 777 by 333, you know, most of us will go to a calculator. That's an incredibly easy computation, right? I mean, compared to most of everything we do, it's incredibly easy computation. So why is the brain, as sophisticated it is, so bad at that? And I think it's in part because of the hardware. The hardware is simply not made to do that. Everybody will say, oh, but we didn't evolve to do that. True, totally true. But no computer scientist or engineer would build a calculator using neurons, because it's the wrong hardware for that. So I think at the same time, in other domains now, beyond mental numerical calculations, rational decisions that are not influenced by biased decisions. So we can influence your decisions to think of things that are the wrong answer. So a common example I use in English is I say...
There we are good.
In
that field we are good.
Yeah.
I don't know if I understand correctly what you said.
So the question is, if I can influence people we can influence each other, and we always do, to make correct or incorrect decisions. And if I ask you quickly, Teresa, what do cows drink? What pops into most people's head, I think, is milk. But that's the wrong answer. So we prime each other, and this reflects the associative architecture of the brain. As Wolf said, cows activated with milk, and we bind those two connections because of Hebbian plasticity, and then we often lead to the wrong answer. So the brain is incredibly fallible, and I think the best we can do as humans is to remember that and take that into account when we're doing science, when we're making our decisions.
So let's go back to the time question.
Okay.
Now, one of the other books you have is Your Brain is a Time Machine, and because you try to understand how we perceive the passage of time. And today you also mentioned that we are able to perceive the passage of time from milliseconds to days or weeks. So tell us a bit about how the brain is a time machine.
Well, the brain's a time machine on a number of levels, and I'm, of course, using this as a metaphor. The brain is a time machine in that, in many ways, if the brain had one job, at least in my opinion, and others may have different opinions, I think its main job is to predict the future, because that translates into the evolutionary currency of survival and reproduction. An animal that can predict where the food will be, where its enemies will be, where the predators will be, when the sun will rise, that translates into survival and reproduction. The brain is also a time machine because it tells time. And the brain tells time across a vast range of scales, from milliseconds in speech to days and circulunar rhythms and hibernations. What's interesting is that the brain is very different from our standard clocks, and that it has many different clocks in it. So Joe just mentioned famous experiments by Aschoff, in which he had people in a bunker and he could see the circadian clock still oscillate at a 24-hour cycle. What's interesting in those studies is that Aschoff also had people do timing tests on the 100 millisecond scale. So because Aschoff was interested in whether, if your circadian clock was off, if your timing for music or something would be off. And the answer is no, it wasn't off. So Aschoff had some of the early data on that. So clearly we have other mechanisms to tell time, and those mechanisms on the timing of seconds are more related to what Wolf was just speaking to, neural dynamics of neurons. And third point, I'll give you 4 reasons why the brain is a time machine. Third point is the brain creates the subjective feeling of time, the perception of time, which the brain always does, right? The brain creates subjective perception of color, of space, of body. And it does this wonderful, endows us with this ability to perceive the passage of time, which is, of course, an approximation of objective time. And finally, the brain, in a slightly more literal way, is a time machine in that it does allow us to engage in mental time travel. I think physicists are pretty much on board that true physical time travel is not a question that will be happening within the laws of physics. There's some people might disagree with that, but I think that's the standard view. Safe to say that. So the closest we'll ever come to true time travel is mental time travel, which basically just means thinking back in the history. Last time I met people here when we had the meetings, and that allows us to, the point of those memories of mental time travel backwards is not to reminisce, is not for nostalgia, it's to help us prepare for the future. And then we can go the other way, in which we can think and simulate potential different futures. You probably did that for this. You can think, oh, what will happen if I ask this question or this question? That's important. It's critical for all our jobs. And that ability to mentally project ourselves, or what will Joe answer, what will Jimena answer to that? So that is a uniquely human feature that makes Homo sapiens sapient.
And I predict that if I speak to you about the brain as a time machine, that we will talk about the mental time travels, as you did.
Exactly, very predictable.
But is this a unique human feature, in your opinion? Because I think probably some people would say no.
We're a product of evolution, so almost any human cognitive ability, much as in physical ability, has some sort of precedent in the animal kingdom. So even language, things that we typically associate with humans. So there's an ongoing debate about the degree to which other animals can engage in mental time travel. What your prediction is, some people will say that other animals can also do it. The common answer there is maybe squirrels storing food or a bird building a nest. Most people don't consider that mental time travel because we view it as an innate reflex. Animals don't need to experience, they don't need social interaction to engage in those things. A bird that has the correct hormones might go build a nest, and a squirrel that never experienced winter and that lives in a warm place might also store food. But some of the best evidence, interestingly enough, for mental time travel in the animal kingdom is actually from birds. So there's scrub jays seem to have a bit of an ability to take into account the properties of objects. So they have 2 types of food sources. One is worms, one is nuts. The worms decay quickly and the nuts last a long time. And so they know that if they've stored the food and immediately go back, they go back to the worms. If they go back, but if they have to wait, they go to the nuts. So they seem to have a mental tracking of the passage of time. So I think there'll be examples of mental time travel in animals, but there's no doubt that this is a uniquely human, or human can perform mental time travel and think about the long term to a very different degree. Now, that doesn't mean we're particularly good at it. We should be a lot better than we are. So both in our personal lives and as
Could you explain better that idea, because it's interesting?
So human beings, one of the things that make us unique is we engage in an incredible amount of future-oriented activities, right? Brushing my teeth, most animals don't do that because I brush my teeth because I want to have my teeth when I'm older. And most of what we do, we work until we get money so we can retire. So most of the activities we engage in are future-oriented. And most animals have a very present-based outlook. So that's something that makes us unique. But we shouldn't take too much pride in that because we're actually quite bad at it. And many problems we have as members, as individuals and members of society are because of the lack of long-term thinking. Whether it's I didn't save enough for retirement, I don't exercise, I don't eat correctly. And of course, the big societal issue at this stage is climate change, right? So climate change is something that's particularly hard to address because it's very hard for people to feel invested in making short-term sacrifices for something that's very far into the distant future.
Oh, so that's a good example, or at least a good reason to explain why some people don't do anything about climate change, because we don't see it as a near risk that will threaten our lives.
I think, in my opinion, that's absolutely one factor, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So about these mental time travels, you also, because of we have this ability, so we also can foresee our future, and also have this idea that we will gonna die one day, and this realization could have huge implications.
Yeah,
philosophically speaking, even.
So the brain does its best to predict the future, and evolutionarily, at some point, humans presumably, when we started building tools. The amazing thing about building a tool, and that's taken as something that's uniquely human, to me, in many ways, it's not the tool itself. It's storing the tool and thinking, I'm going to use that tool. And, a lot of animals and humans use tools, but perhaps the bigger side of intelligence is storing the tool for future use, right? That's something that, sometimes teenagers have a trouble grasping in terms of putting the things away for future use. Now, so presumably at some point in human evolution, we saw the inevitable that someday we're going to die. And that had to come as a bit of a shock to the system. And some people have argued, some philosophers and anthropologists have argued that this ability to look into the future, this is something I agree with, might have co-evolved with the origins of religions or folk beliefs or folk religions as a way to cope with this newly developed cognitive ability to inevitably see that we're ephemeral.
So, and that will lead us to the conclusion that, for instance, the idea of God might be an idea of a human idea, an idea from our minds, our brains. Oh, sorry. That would lead us to the question that this could lead us to the idea that God is a human creation. The idea of God is a human creation, in your opinion, I suppose.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. I would think, in my opinion, that the universality of religion in the absence of any real evidence for those is an indication that our religious beliefs come from within, not from the outside. So I think many philosophers and scientists take that view that beliefs in, I should probably say supernatural. Religion often means connotation of something that's an organized social activity. So early on, these were belief in the supernatural, but many people take that view that supernatural beliefs were evolutionarily adaptive, and that we evolved to have those for some evolutionary reason.
Let me go back a bit. You also mentioned that our brain as a time machine, we have this subjective perspective of time. Our perspective of time could be very elastic, I would say. So we can sense time as moving fast or slow. in your opinion, what will be the key element for this? It will be the attention we pay to the passage of time, or as someone mentioned this morning, also the attention we pay to our body?
There's no doubt that it's all of the above. That's crystal clear. It can be the situation in which I am, if I'm meditating or if I'm thinking, that's some internal focus. But, you know, a trivial example is if you're in pain, pain is a somatic response. If you're in a pain and somebody's pinching you, that tends to make time go by slowly. So in some sense, there's absolutely no doubt that the state of the body, the state of the mind, the social context you're in, the psychopharmacological context you're in, meaning if you're taking psychoactive drugs or other drugs, influences time. So these are absolutely no doubt that our subjective experience of time is influenced by all those factors.
Another interesting aspect of your work is that you try to explore the interactions between neuroscience and also physics, the physics of time. Do you think there is also a gap here? I mean, the time the biological time, the psychological time we experience on Earth is not the same as we see it as the time in the physics or the time in the universe. So how could we in somehow correlate these two things?
So this is an important question regarding that time means very different things. So the people, we use time to mean different things. Even in English to Portuguese, time and tempo are slightly different words because the word tempo is used in a very different context sometimes because it also means something meteorological. But the interaction between the neuroscience of time and physics of time, there's some tension there. That's true, and this is more on the debate. So this is more speculative and on the philosophical side. And in physics and philosophy, there's two views of the nature of time, the physical natures of time. And one is what we call presentism. And in presentism, only the present is real. The past was real, the future will be real, but it's undetermined. The counter view is called eternalism or the block universe. And in the block universe, the past, present, and future are equally real. The semantics here gets a bit, you have to be careful because language wasn't made to talk about four-dimensional time. So under that context, the notion is that we're in an arbitrary point. So the idea is now is to time as here is to space. We all acknowledge here is just one point in space. There's other points in space. So under eternalism, there's other points in time, other moments in time that are equally real. Now, so one way to distinguish this is under presentism, the concept of time travel, physical time travel, is absolutely impossible. So you can't have time travel under presentism. Under eternalism, you can talk about it because it's a theoretical possibility. Now, where does neuroscience come in? Neuroscience comes in the sense that we all perceive subjectively that the present is fundamentally different from the past and future, right? Everybody here has to acknowledge that because we feel that we've lost opportunities to interfere with the past. That's gone. It's in our memories. And the future is yet to be made. So the question is why in physics there's a slight preference for eternalism. What I and others have argued is that we should take the brain evolved to understand a universe governed by the laws of physics. We evolved, we were selected to evolve under those circumstances. To do that, we need to understand intuitively understand the laws of physics at the mesoscale level. We don't need to understand the laws of physics at the quantum mechanical level or the cosmological level, which is why our intuitions are horrible, right? Our intuitions of cosmological level physics and quantum mechanical level physics are absolutely horrible. But our intuitions of mesoscale physics, of the world and we're interacting with it, which is mostly Newtonian physics, are actually quite good. And if they weren't, we wouldn't be alive. And time is at the mesoscale. So our argument is that because time is at the mesoscale, our subjective experience of the passage of time are probably accurate. And in the absence of evidence from physics towards eternalism or presentism, which is there no empirical evidence either way that we should favor presentism and trust the brain's subjective experiences in that regard.
Jimena, do you want to add anything about this gap between different times?
Sure. I mean, I guess, what it's a very, very, very useful way to divide the physics into such camps. I guess an interesting thing is to point out what do we lose by dividing into two camps, or why do we divide it in two camps? So, for example, what's lost intellectually in having these bifurcated subjective or objective notion? So why, for example, can you get lost and arrive at a supermarket and not your house, but you never get lost and arrive last Tuesday, right? So these questions about the unique dimension of time in physics and how they actually fit or not fit with subjective time, and how subjective time is also tied to, understood by reference to similar machines, is a bit of a reflection of our historical and cultural moment, impasse. And I was very struck at your main talk, how you talk about the brain as a timer, but not the brain as a clockmaker.
Yeah, I think I sort of meant a bit of both. It's certainly a timer. The words timer and clock, I think sometimes we use ambiguously and imprecisely. Right. Maybe that's the problem.
No, but it's focused on sort of lower level temporal activities. Most of neuroscience, most of the valid experiments in neuroscience. And what happens if we really think about the brain, also the brain of the scientist, the brain as the person who is creating these tools through which we're understanding our own subjectivity. These objective tools don't come out of nowhere. They've been made by us for certain purposes. So that makes it a little bit of we're not coming from nowhere understanding the brain as a neuroscience, but the neuroscientist, which is I'm more interested in studying scientists than nature. The neuroscientist itself. How does it?
That makes you a neuroscientist. Yeah.
Yes. How has it come to this?
I will go there.
Yes. Okay.
No, please.
Yes. No, that's
yes. About precisely, you like to study scientists.
Yes.
And you study what happened between Einstein and Henry Bergson, and that huge clash they have in 1992. So. About this was a dispute between a physicist and a philosopher. So could you take us there to that moment, to that place, to that debate, and tell us a bit what happened?
Sure. And it was just 2 days, 100 days ago. So what happened is that Einstein went to Paris to give a lecture on April 6, 1922, and sitting at the audience of the Société Française de Philosophie was the philosopher who was known for his theory of time, Henri Bergson, and who is now a lot less known than Einstein. And they had a discussion in which Bergson spoke about half an hour, and then Einstein just responded, and it isn't clear how well he understood French, but he just responded. He said, "The time of the philosophers does not exist." And it represents the moment in which the sort of baton of who gets to speak about science shifted from philosophy. And previously it was theology and the humanities, and poets could all have something to say about real time. But that, since Einstein shifted to Stephen Hawking and mostly scientists in the physical sciences, but neuroscientists on their heels, but still the most successful books about time, I think, are still by cosmologists and physicists, and the general public searches for those rather than neuroscience. But it represents this division, which I think has marked the century of between subjective and objective time,
Exactly.
and that we're, there's so many paradox and unresolved questions that perhaps a way out is involves expanding what we consider to be good experiments, good neuroscience.
And are we still experiencing the echoes of that clash between physics and philosophy today?
Definitely. I think, this conference was very much an exception by bringing in all disciplines to so many different disciplines to talk to each other. But the most prominent voices in the field of physics, although they acknowledge that there are philosophical underpinnings to what they do, there's still a very, very fixed hierarchy. Stephen Hawking has given some of the comments that philosophy is dead. Stephen Weinberg, Richard Feynman, that philosophy is as useful to the scientist as ornithology is to birds. And they're very frequently, as when you step back and look at it as a larger historical cultural system, you see scientists employ philosophical concepts that are not examined or acknowledged, but are implicit.
What would you respond to those provocative?
Well, I think that we need to think about the creation of instruments more carefully, because when technology occupies like a no role, it's still not thought of as how does it enter, where did we get it, who gets it, who uses it, how is it tied to entertainment industry, to defense industry, to consumer electronics, and how those things then impact the theories of the mind that we end up adopting. So thinking more carefully about the role of the creation of technology and the brain as a cultural machine as well. So culture is a huge. The brain is a time machine, but culture is perhaps still the most powerful time machine that there is in regulating social relations. Everything from eating at the right time, which is a social activity and a ritual, as well as marking the calendars, vacations, rest, health. So,
from the point of view of scientific rules, I think Einstein might have won the battle.
Yes, absolutely.
But in your talk, you say that there is a trouble with Einstein's time, and the trouble is that what you just mentioned, or is there?
That's the trouble. I think the trouble is the legacy of this divided discourse, and the different radically different hierarchies amongst disciplines, the disappearance of culture and the disappearance of the scientist as the inventor, somebody that needs to be put in the picture as well. So we need knowledge, obviously, but I think we also need knowledge about knowledge to have a most robust system across cultures and disciplines.
So you are fascinated about scientists and also about time. So how do you bond together those two?
Good question. Well, I think there is a sense of in which a big looking at history in really big terms. The shift from a culture that was regulated by religion to a scientific culture, and time, how it went from one to the other, and some similar problems persisted. So the church as the big cultural timekeeper, the ringing of the bells, to these instruments that can measure nanoseconds or neural synapses. But there's a lot in science. Our scientific culture, the rise of our scientific culture, has to come with a mystery and it's no longer the mystery of God, but it's the mystery of time.
Oh. So that's why we are so fascinated in the Western society, at least with time, measure time.
I think so.
So I don't know if you want to comment, any comment from what you heard from each other?
Yeah, I think what touched me most was this postulate that the humanities and the natural sciences should come together again. Because my feeling is that many of the very difficult conundra that the natural sciences fight with in the moment, like the explanation of time, or the explanation of consciousness, or the explanation of the nature of feelings, we tend to believe that we can get at answers for these questions by simply exploring our brains, because our brains are the ones that brought forth those constructs, so they try to understand this. But I think we do neglect very much that once biological evolution had brought forth organisms of sufficient complexity with cognitive abilities like ours, we started to create a new surface, a layer of reality that is an immaterial reality, that is full of concepts, full of terms for something that we can experience together, because we both experience that there's some phenomenon that we now came to call consciousness, or a phenomenon that we came to call time, or a phenomenon that we came to name God, or whatever. And these entities have been created by us following biological evolution. As soon as we started to sit around fireplace and eat together, discover that the respective other is greedy or generous, and so we had shared experiences for immaterial realities. We gave them names. Now they are ontologically different from neurons, no problem, and nobody would doubt that. So if we try to stay in the descriptive systems that describes neurons and interactions and nonlinear dynamics, we will never ever be able to explain the one, or to have a continuous naturalistic account of these various layers of reality. So I think we better be a little bit more humble as natural scientists, take the humanities more seriously, and consider the fact that what they brought forth in their description systems is not stupid. They have spent a lot of time in making the taxonomy proper and sorting out terms, and so we should begin to talk to them seriously, and they should also take us serious, because usually they don't take us very seriously, because they think that what we work with little bricks, and we are the engineers, and they have the great ideas. No. We should be humble on both sides and respect each other, and try to come at grips with this phase transition from phenomena that obviously we have brought into the world. Our animal brothers and sisters, they don't worry about time or about consciousness. They have it, and they work with it. Our problems come from this naming stuff. And it's nice to do philosophy and to juggle with these names and concepts in data-free space. So we should really try to come together humbly and try to solve that problem. And I think without an evolutionary approach and taking seriously that there was biological evolution and there was cultural evolution, and that we created stuff like the content of a belief system that erects cathedrals and sends people to war. These are very mighty concepts, but we won't get at their explanation by looking at individual brains alone. That's okay. Sorry, that was too long.
No, it's okay. No, it was wonderful. I'm also curious about what you are all doing at your labs at this moment. What are you researching or studying, or Joseph?
So can I ask Wolf a question
Oh,
first?
yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So do you really think animals don't worry about time?
Now, I think they don't worry about the concept of time.
Oh, maybe the concept.
Yeah.
They certainly worry about time.
Yes.
So, for example, you know, a bear in the fall knows that it has to gain weight in order to hibernate over winter. It's clearly worried about time. Almost all the animals that are preparing for winter are like that.
No, I wouldn't say they ignore time or they don't have a sense of time. They do, of course. But they don't, obviously it's trivial, not engage in these metaphysical discussions.
That's right.
Exactly.
So they...
Cats, maybe.
As far as we know.
Cats, I don't know.
That's
Rodents, cat. But others animals, I agree, yeah.
Actually, Joseph, you said also in your talk that all the cells have the clocks. So, in the sense, they have clocks, but they don't need to have a brain.
That's correct. You don't need a brain to have a clock.
Circadian clock. Circadian clock.
Right.
So,
but all your cells actually are keeping track of time on an hourly basis, it turns out. So, but they're maybe not self-aware. That's the difference.
As a historian, and I've collected, Takahashi, I've collected all sorts of clocks, you know, just as a historian, the sand clock, the water clock, the sun clock, and one of the most interesting one tied to the book Biological Time by Pierre de Comte-Deneuve was scarring, how quickly you scar as a measure of the real biological time. And I think that's beautiful because it brings together, it's not only the biology of the skin, but also being hurt, going through war. So all these clocks have different broader significances.
Interesting. So, Joseph, want to tell us a bit about what are you researching at this moment?
So, yeah, I mean, aside from trying to further understand how these molecular clocks work, we really are now fascinated with longevity and lifespan, and whether the circadian clock really does play a role in lifespan. And I think that we have some evidence for that I presented in my talk, which is really a new idea in the aging field. There hasn't been much attention paid to time or time of day for long-term processes like aging in people. So I'd say that's, you know, one of our primary areas that we're working on is how does the clock help us live longer? Why does that happen? And why is it that you can eat a McDonald's hamburger at one day and not get fat, at one time of day and not get fat, but at the other time you'll become fat? That's the other big question we're trying to answer.
So, and what approaches are you using? Genetic approaches, drug approaches?
Yeah, so all of those. We use genetics to increase clock, you know, circadian clocks and how strong they are, but we're also searching for drugs that will enhance our clocks. And we use behavior too. So the time that you eat, that's a very simple intervention that we can do. That is a very effective way to manipulate your clock.
So you want, in a certain way, you could become masters of our cell clocks if we were succeeded on doing that strategies. For instance, the behavior one.
Yeah, you have to have some self-control, I guess, to to be able to you know, maintain a strict time schedule, things like that.
Question, so you've done mouse mutants where you fiddle with the clock genes. Have you ever thought of doing human mutants with the clock?
So one of the one of the good things is, you know, we have something like 8 billion people on this planet, and so on the planet there's a mutation for almost every gene that any scientist will want to study.
Okay.
So we have this fantastic resource, which is called, human biology. And so many genes have come
Okay.
that way, from just natural variation and diversity of our DNA. So yes, I thought about that a lot. And we didn't do it, but my colleagues in the field have, studied human timing disorders and discovered the genes. And the very first gene that was found by Louis Ptacek at UCSF was the period 2 gene. So the first 3 genes he found, in fact, in people were the same genes that we had already found in mouse. So there's a very direct connection in at least the genetic control of our clocks.
Okay, thank you. Wolf, you are still doing research, right, in your institute, which I think it's also have an interesting story, your institute, but please tell us first what you are researching.
What I'm doing now?
Yes.
Well, we have accumulated so many phenomena